for a small party on the following Tuesday. Mr. Mulliner himself brought them round. We would always ignore the fact of there being a back door to any house, and gave a louder rat-tat than his mistress, Miss Jameson. He had 3 little notes, which he carried in a large basket, in order to impress his mistress with an idea of their great weight, though they might easily have gone into his waistcoat pocket. Miss Mattie and I quietly decided that we would have a previous engagement at home. It was the evening on which Miss Mattie usually made candle-lighters of all the notes and letters of the week, for on Mondays her accounts were always made straight, not a penny owing from the week before, so by a natural arrangement, making candle-lighters fell upon a Tuesday evening, and gave us a legitimate excuse for declining Miss Jameson's invitation. But before our answer was written, in came Miss Pole with an open note in her hand. "So," she said, "ah, I see you have got your note too. Better late than never. I could have told my Lady Glenmire she would be glad enough of our society before a fortnight was over." "Yes," said Miss Mattie, "we're asked for Tuesday evening, and perhaps you would just kindly bring your work across and drink tea with us that night. It is my usual regular time for looking over the last week's bills and notes and letters and making candle-lighters of them, but that does not seem quite reason enough for saying I have a previous engagement at home, though I meant to make it do. Now, if you would come, my conscience would be quite at ease, and luckily the note is not written yet." I saw Miss Pole's countenance change while Miss Mattie was speaking. "Don't you mean to go, then?" asked she. "Oh, no," said Miss Mattie quietly. "You don't either, I suppose?" "I don't know," replied Miss Pole. "Yes, I think I do," said she, rather briskly, and on seeing Miss Mattie look surprised, she added, "You see, one would not like Miss Jameson to think that anything she could do or say was of consequence enough to give offense. It would be a kind of letting down of ourselves that I, for one, should not like. It would be too flattering to Miss Jameson if we allowed her to suppose that what she had said affected us a week, nay, 10 days afterwards. Well, I suppose it is wrong to be hurt and annoyed so long about anything, and perhaps, after all, she did not mean to vex us. But I must say, I could not have brought myself to say the things Miss Jameson did about our not calling. I really don't think I shall go." "Oh, come, Miss Mattie, you must go. You know our friend Miss Jameson is much more phlegmatic than most people, and does not enter into the little delicacies of feelings which you possess in so remarkable a degree." "I thought you possessed them too, that day Miss Jameson called to tell us not to go," said Miss Mattie innocently. But Miss Pole, in addition to her delicacies of feeling, possessed a very smart cap, which she was anxious to show to an admiring world, and so she seemed to forget all her angry words uttered not a fortnight before, and to be ready to act on what she called the great Christian principle of forgive and forget. And she lectured dear Miss Mattie so long on this head that she absolutely ended by assuring her it was her duty, as a deceased rector's daughter, to buy a new cap and go to the party of Miss Jameson's. So we were most happy to accept, instead of regretting that we were obliged to decline. The expenditure on dress in Cranford was principally in that one article referred to. If the heads were buried in smart new caps, the ladies were like ostriches, and cared not what became of their bodies. Old gowns, white and venerable collars, any number of brooches, up and down and everywhere, some with dog eyes painted in them, some that were like small picture frames with mausoleums and weeping willows neatly executed in hair inside. Some again with miniatures of ladies and gentlemen sweetly smiling out of a nest of stiff muslins. Old brooches for a permanent ornament, and new caps to suit the fashion of the day. The ladies of Cranford always dressed with chaste elegance and propriety, as Miss Barker once prettily expressed it. And with 3 new caps and a greater array of brooches than had ever been seen together at one time since Cranford was a town, did Miss Forrester and Miss Mattie and Miss Pole appear on that memorable Tuesday evening. I counted 7 brooches myself on Miss Pole's dress. 2 were fixed negligently in her cap. 1 was a butterfly made of Scotch pebbles, which a vivid imagination might believe to be a real insect. 1 fastened her net neckerchief, 1 her collar, 1 ornamented the front of her gown midway between her throat and waist, and another adorned the point of her stomacher. Where the 7th was, I have forgotten. but it was somewhere about her, I am sure. But I am getting on too fast in describing the dresses of the company. I should first relate the gathering on the way to Miss Jameson's. That lady lived in a large house just outside the town. A road which had known what it was to be a street ran right before the house, which opened out upon it without any intervening garden or court. Whatever the sun was about, he never shone on the front of that house. To be sure, the living rooms were at the back, looking on to a pleasant garden. The front windows only belonged to kitchens and housekeepers' rooms and pantries, and in one of them Mr. Mulliner was reported to sit. Indeed, looking askance, we often saw the back of a head covered with hair powder, which also extended itself over his coat collar down to his very waist, and this imposing back was always engaged in reading the St. James Chronicle, opened wide, which in some degree accounted for the length of time the said newspaper was in reaching us. Equal subscribers with Miss Jameson, though, and right of her honorableness, she always had the reading of it first. This very Tuesday the delay in forwarding the last number had been particularly aggravating, just when both Miss Pole and Miss Mattie, the former more especially, had been wanting to see it in order to coach up the court news ready for the evening's interview with aristocracy. Miss Pole told us she had absolutely taken time by the forelock and been dressed by 5 o'clock in order to be ready if the St. James Chronicle should come in at the last moment. The very St. James Chronicle, which the powdered head was tranquilly and composedly reading as we passed the accustomed window this evening. "The impudence of the man," said Miss Pole in a low, indignant whisper. "I should like to ask him whether his mistress pays her quarter share for his exclusive use." We looked at her in admiration of the courage of her thought, for Mr. Mulliner was an object of great awe to all of us. He seemed never to have forgotten his condescending in coming to live at Cranford. Miss Jenkins, at times, had stood forth as the undaunted champion of her sex, and spoken to him on terms of equality. But even Miss Jenkins could get no higher. In his pleasant and most gracious moods, he looked like a sulky cockatoo. He did not speak except in gruff monosyllables. He would wait in the hall when we begged him not to wait, and then look deeply offended because we had kept him there, while, with trembling, hasty hands, we prepared ourselves for appearing in company. Miss Pole ventured on a small joke as we went upstairs, intended, though addressed to us, to afford Mr. Mulliner some slight amusement. We all smiled in order to seem as if we felt at our ease, and timidly looked for Mr. Mulliner's sympathy. Not a muscle of that wooden face had relaxed, and we were grave in an instant. Miss Jameson's drawing-room was cheerful. The evening sun came streaming into it, and the large square window was clustered round with flowers. The furniture was white and gold, not the later style, Louis Couture, I think they call it, all shells and twirls. No, Miss Jameson's chair and tables had not a curve or bend about them. The chair and table legs diminished as they neared the ground, and were straight and square in all their corners. The chairs were all a row against the walls, with the exception of 4 or 5 which stood in a circle round the fire. They were railed with white bars across the back and knobbed with gold. Neither the railings nor the knobs invited ease. There was a Japan table devoted to literature, on which lay a Bible, a peerage, and a prayer book. There was another square Pembroke table dedicated to the fine arts, on which were a kaleidoscope, conversation cards, puzzle cards, tied together to an interminable length with faded pink satin ribbon, and a box painted in fond imitation of the drawing which decorated tea-chest. Carlo lay on the worst worked rug, and ungraciously barked at us as we entered. Miss Jameson stood up, giving us each a torpid smile of welcome, and looking helplessly beyond us at Mr. Mulliner, as if she hoped he would place us in chairs, for if he did not, she never could. I suppose he thought we could find our way to the circle round the fire, which reminded me of Stonehenge. I don't know why. Lady Glenmire came to the rescue of our hostess, and, somehow or other, we found ourselves for the first time placed agreeably and not formally in Miss Jameson's house. Lady Glenmire, now we had time to look at her, proved to be a bright little woman of middle age, who had been very pretty in the days of her youth, and who was even yet very pleasant looking. I saw Miss Pole appraising her dress in the first 5 minutes, and I take her word when she said the next day, "My dear, £10 would have purchased every stitch she had on, lace and all." It was pleasant to suspect that a peeress could be poor, and partly reconciled us to the fact that her husband had never sat in the House of the Lords, which, when we first heard of it, seemed a kind of swindling us out of our prospects on false pretense, a sort of a lord and no lord business. We were all very silent at first. We were thinking what we could talk about that should be high enough to interest my lady. There had been a rise in the price of sugar, which, as preserving time was near, was a piece of intelligence to all our housekeeping hearts, and would have been the natural topic if Lady Glenmire had not been by. But we were not sure if the peerage ate preserves, much less knew how they were made. At last, Miss Pole, who had always a great deal of courage and savoir-faire, spoke to Lady Glenmire, who on her part had seemed just as puzzled to know how to break the silence as we were. "Has your ladyship been to court lately?" asked she, and then gave a little glance around at us, half timid and half triumphant, as much as to say, "See how judicial I have chosen a subject befitting the rank of the stranger." "I never was there in my life," said Lady Glenmire, with a broad Scotch accent, but in a very sweet voice. And then, as if she had been too abrupt, she added, "We very seldom went to London, only twice, in fact, during all my married life, and before I was married my father had far too large a family. Fifth daughter of Mr. Campbell was in all our minds, I am sure, to take us often from our home, even to Edinburgh. Y'all have been in Edinburgh, maybe?" said she, suddenly brightening up with the hope of a common interest. "We had none of us been there, but Miss Pole had an uncle who had once passed a night there, which was very pleasant." Miss Jameson meanwhile was absorbed in wonder why Mr. Mulliner did not bring the tea, and at length the wonder oozed out of her mouth. "I had better ring the bell, my dear, had not I?" said Lady Glenmire briskly. "No, I think not. Mulliner does not like to be hurried. We should have liked our tea, for we dined at an earlier hour than Miss Jameson. I suspect Mr. Mulliner had to finish the St. James Chronicle before he chose to trouble himself about tea." His mistress fidgeted and kept saying, "I can't think why Mulliner does not bring tea. I can't think what he can be about." And Lady Glenmire at last grew quite impatient, but it was a very pretty kind of impatience after all, and she rang the bell rather sharply on receiving a half permission from her sister-in-law to do so. Mr. Mulliner appeared in dignified surprise. "Oh," said Miss Jameson, "Lady Glenmire rang the bell. I believe it was for tea." In a few minutes tea was brought. Very delicate was the china, very old the plate, very thin the bread and butter, and very small the lumps of sugar. Sugar was evidently Miss Jameson's favorite economy. I question if the little filigree sugar tongs, made something like scissors, could have opened themselves wide enough to take up an honest, vulgar good-sized piece, and when I tried to seize two little minikin pieces at once, so as not to be detected in too many returns to the sugar basin, they absolutely dropped one, with a little sharp clatter, quite in a malicious and unnatural manner. But before this happened, we had had a slight disappointment. In the little silver jug was cream, and the large one was milk. As soon as Mr. Mulliner came in, Carlo began to beg, which was a thing our manners forbade us to do, though I am sure we were just as hungry, and Miss Jameson said she was certain we would excuse her if she gave her poor dumb Carlo his first tea. She accordingly mixed a saucerful for him, and put it down for him to lap, and then she told us how intelligent and sensible the dear little fellow was. He knew cream quite well, and constantly refused tea with only milk in it, so the milk was left for us. But we silently thought we were quite as intelligible and sensible as Carlo, and felt as if insult were added to injury when we were called upon to admire the gratitude evinced by his wagging his tail for the cream, which should have been ours. After tea we thawed down into common life subjects. We were thankful to Lady Glenmire for having proposed some more bread and butter, and this mutual want made us better acquainted with her than we should ever have been with talking about the court, though Miss Pole did say she had hoped to know how the dear Queen was from someone who had seen her. The friendship begun over bread and butter extended on to cards. Lady Glenmire played preference to admiration, and was a complete authority as to ombre and quadrille. Even Miss Pole quite forgot to say "my lady" and "your ladyship," and said "Basto, ma'am. You have spadille, I believe," just as quietly as if we had never held the great Cranford Parliament on the subject of the proper mode of addressing a peeress. As a proof of how thoroughly we had forgotten that we were in the presence of one who might have sat down to tea with a coronet,